Hey, welcome to FISM News. I'm Samuel Case.
And I'm Renata Kiss.
And tonight, President Biden speaks to college graduates.
Meanwhile, the ICC issues arrest warrants for Israeli leaders.
And Iran's president dies in a helicopter crash. But first, the National Rifle Association officially endorsed Donald Trump for president over the weekend. Trump was the keynote speaker at the NRA's annual meeting in Dallas, Texas on Saturday. And there he said that gun rights are under siege by the Biden administration.
No doubt the survival of our Second Amendment is very much on the ballot. You know what they want to do. They're going to, if they get in, our country is going to be destroyed in so many ways, but the Second Amendment will be, it's under siege. If the Biden regime gets 4 more years, they are coming for your guns, 100% certain. Crooked Joe has a 40-year record of trying to rip firearms out of the hands of law-abiding citizens.
Trump also took aim at independent candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for calling the NRA a, quote, terror group back in 2018 following the school shooting in Parkland, Florida. Meanwhile, for his part, Trump said he will be a brick wall for the Second Amendment if he's reelected.
In the White House, the radical gun grabbers will run straight into a very, very powerful brick wall. Their dreams of taking away your God-given rights will die when the polls close on November 5th, 2024. Those dreams that they have will be dead.
Now, the NRA's endorsement hardly comes as a surprise, as the association did endorse Trump in both 2016 and then again in 2020.
Meanwhile, President Biden was the latest to give a commencement speech to the graduating class at Morehouse College. But the historically black college in Atlanta was unamused. One student called for a ceasefire in Gaza, which Biden ended up applauding. He also promised that he heard their voices and he supported peaceful, nonviolent protests. Others were seen turning their backs to the president during his speech, which included the Democrat narrative that black people were victims of American society.
What is democracy? If black men are being killed in the street, what is democracy? Betrayal of broken promises still leave black communities behind. What is democracy? You have to be 10 times better than anyone else to get a fair shot. And most of all, what does it mean, as we've heard before, to be a black man who loves his country, even if it doesn't love him back in equal measure?
Now, despite student disapproval, Biden finished his speech without any commotion. However, before Biden's appearance, some students had requested that the school rescind his invitation. One student even called his presence insulting.
Now, Renata, we were talking before the show that some conservatives have been viewing this as sort of a win. They're like, look, the black students are turning on Joe Biden. But you said that in your research, this doesn't really seem to be a conservative response. This is more of a left-wing response to Joe Biden.
Yeah, it wasn't clear to me. There were obviously students who were pro-Palestine or pro-Hamas. There was one girl who, did the power sign and everything. Yeah. So I wouldn't say that she was conservative.
Not exactly right-wing.
And I have no idea if the rest of the students were or were not. It didn't seem that way to me.
Yeah, it doesn't seem that way either. Yeah, interesting. Meanwhile, speaking of anti-Israel protests, they ended in more arrests over the weekend, as on Friday, police arrested 19 people trying to occupy a building at the University of Pennsylvania. The majority of those agitators, though, were not UPenn students, and several are facing felony charges. The following day, New York police then clashed with protesters in Brooklyn when a crowd of roughly 200 people blocked the street, resulting in dozens of arrests. Meanwhile, Drexel University in Philadelphia, they announced yesterday that all campus buildings are now on lockdown after anti-Israel protesters set up a new encampment over the weekend. Non-students have now been warned about trespassing, but so far have refused to leave the campus. No police actions have been taken as of yet.
Meanwhile, President Biden is announcing yet another round of student loan forgiveness, this time for households earning over $300,000. Biden's SAFE plan has already loaded taxpayers with over $400 billion, and this new plan would add an additional $84 billion in taxpayer burden. Based on analysis from the University of Pennsylvania, the latest debt relief would potentially cancel debt for about 500,000 750,000 high-income households. The study found that the average relief for these families would be over $25,000. Biden's latest attempt at student loan forgiveness sparked a number of lawsuits. One of them called Biden's efforts a troubling pattern of twisting the language of old statutes to justify his drastic actions. One economist at the University of Cincinnati added that his colleagues have real concern over these loan forgiveness attempts because they could further contribute to inflation.
Elsewhere, House Democrats are pushing back on Republicans' efforts to stop people who aren't American citizens from voting in elections. Republicans are trying to pass a bill that would block a Washington, D.C. law allowing non-citizens to vote in their local elections. According to Axios, Democratic leadership is now actively telling lawmakers to vote against that bill when it comes to the floor for a vote later this week. Democrats accuse Republicans of trying to undermine the political self-determination of Washington, D.C.'s residents. The vote comes as Republicans have been warning of non-citizens potentially voting in this year's presidential elections. Democrats say Republicans are simply pushing a, quote, non-issue in order to support potential election challenges should Donald Trump lose the election in November.
And speaking of elections, a left-wing organization is pushing for questionable election tactics. The Election Infrastructure Initiative held a webinar recently teaching local election officials how to utilize federal work-study programs to benefit Democrat turnout. These work-study programs are meant to employ students to help pay for their college tuition, and the left-wing program's activities would include supporting the entire voting process. According to the Off the Press, the initiative is meant to comply with an executive order that allows federal agencies to use taxpayer dollars for political campaigns. The Election Infrastructure Initiative is a joint venture between the left-wing Center for Tech and Civic Life and the Center for Secure and Modern Elections, which, quote, seeks to help congressional Democrats pass a proposed infrastructure bill, including sweeping changes to the elections process. And coming up, we'll look at the latest on the war in Gaza and other international coverage, so stay tuned.
FISM News is a conservative news outlet bringing you the latest updates from a biblical worldview. With us, you get just the news grounded in truth. And now with the new FISM TV app, you can take FISM News with you wherever you go, so you're never behind on what's happening. We update the app regularly with short clips you can watch at your convenience. So go ahead, visit the App Store and download the FISM TV app. Start exploring all of our content anytime, anywhere.
There are moments in life that define us. Choices determine the courses we take. Choices that create life, or those that save a life. And some make life worthwhile. There are decisions to stay or to go, to remain the same or to grow. Sometimes we pray and make peace. Other times we take a stand for what we believe. In celebration, mourning, triumph, and defeat, we are invested in every decision we seek. Despite differences, we have one thing in common, the desire to do all for the glory of God. Keep your wallet aligned with your heart and your investments in harmony with your faith. Timothy Plan, biblically responsible mutual funds, ETFs, and retirement plans. Before investing, carefully consider a fund's investment objective, risks, charges, and expenses contained in the prospectus available at timothyplan.com. Read carefully before investing.
Hi, I'm Aisha. At first, I was debating whether or not I was really pregnant and took a test. While I was waiting, they talked to me about different pregnancy choices and different options and information that helped me be more educated. To confirm, I got an ultrasound of the pregnancy test, and it was for sure positive, and I got to hear and see my baby for the first time. Hearing the heartbeat made me cry, and it was certain that I was going to keep my baby forever.
And welcome back to FISM News. I'm Renata Kiss. Well, let's move to something we mentioned at the start of the show, and that's the surprising death of the Iranian president. For more information on this shocking development, we go to FISM's Ian Patrick.
The world was shocked over the weekend to hear that Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi was involved in a helicopter crash. And reports from earlier today seemingly confirmed that the president was, in fact, killed in that very same crash, along with some other Iranian officials. Razi was returning to Iran from the neighboring country of Azerbaijan through some dense fog. State media initially had reported that the helicopter experienced a hard landing, but later stated that, quote, all passengers of the helicopter carrying the Iranian president and foreign minister were martyred, and that's in the state media's words. Many neighboring and friendly nations to Iran expressed their condolences upon the news. That includes Saudi Arabia, Syria, Iraq, and Pakistan, just to name a few. Even Russian President Vladimir Putin referred to Razi as a true friend of Russia and even offered to help with the investigation into his death. Some other nations also expressed their condolences, and that includes the European Union and Japan, but reactions were few and far between for most of the West. Razi was seen as a hardline political figure for Iran and one who did not get along well with the Western world. Even before his ascension to the presidency, Razi was an infamous figure. Informally known as the Butcher of Tehran, Razi helped oversee the execution of thousands in the 1980s at the end of the Iran-Iraq War. But during his tenure as president, which was since 2021, Razi tightened national morality law, which notably contributed to the death of a young woman and led to anti-government protests. But after those protests sprung up, they were met with often a brutal response from Razi's government. In addition, Razi has overseen an increasingly encroaching nuclear program, which many, including the United States, believe would be used to make and deploy nuclear weapons. Iran is also a notorious sponsor for the terrorist group Hamas, which launched the attack against Israel on October 7th, which led to the current war in Gaza. Hamas also expressed their condolences upon the news, and some were even quick to blame Israel for the resulting crash. And unnamed Israeli officials commented, saying, quote, it wasn't us, but Israeli politician Avigdor Lieberman made a more bold statement on the news. According to a comment he made to Ynet News, Lieberman said the death won't affect Israel's attitude concerning Iran. He added that, quote, there was no doubt that the president was a brutal man. We won't shed a tear. The Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who has the final say in political matters in the nation, said that first Vice President Mohammad Mokber would take the spot for the time being. He also announced 5 days of public mourning over the president's death. This is Ian Patrick reporting for FISM News.
Thanks so much, Ian. Shocking stuff indeed, and we'll be following the fallout from his death. Meanwhile, more major news coming out of the Middle East. This time, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court is now seeking arrest warrants for leaders of both Hamas and Israel. He said Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his defense chief, quote, bear criminal responsibility for alleged war crimes in Gaza. Take a look.
The crimes include starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, willfully causing great suffering, serious injury to body or health or cruel treatment, willful killing or murder, and intentionally directing attacks against a civilian population, as well as crimes against humanity of extermination and or murder, persecution, and allegations of crimes of committing other inhumane acts.
He then also laid out a list of crimes committed by Hamas chief Yahya Sinwar and 2 other Hamas leaders as well.
Extermination as a crime against humanity. Murder as a crime against humanity and as a war crime. The taking of hostages as a war crime. Rape and other acts of sexual violence during captivity as crimes against humanity and as war crimes. Torture during captivity as a crime against humanity and as a war crime.
Now, the announcement was widely condemned by Israeli officials. Israeli War Cabinet Minister, for example, Benny Gantz, who, by the way, is also Netanyahu's chief political rival, he said this, quote, drawing parallels between the leaders of a democratic country to leaders of a bloodthirsty terror organization is a deep distortion of justice and blatant moral bankruptcy.
Meanwhile, internal conflict is brewing in Israel's war cabinet. Benny Gantz, the rival of Netanyahu, told the prime minister Saturday that if they cannot agree on a post-war strategy, his party will leave the government by June 8th. The criticism came after Defense Minister Yoav Gallant expressed similar remarks over Netanyahu's unwillingness to draft a post-war strategy.
Unfortunately, this issue was not raised for debate, and worse, an alternative was not raised in its replacement. Indecision is in essence a decision, This leads to a dangerous course, which promotes the idea of Israeli military and civilian governance in Gaza. This is a negative and dangerous option for the state of Israel strategically, militarily, and from a security standpoint.
This all comes as the U.S. and Gantz are trying to push for a renewed Palestinian Authority over Gaza, which would include help from Saudi Arabia and the other Arab states. Netanyahu's office says that Gantz's plan for Gaza would be a defeat for Israel and the abandonment of most hostages.
And speaking of Gaza, Israel now claims to have found hundreds of Hamas tunnels in the southern city of Rafah, including some of them crossing into the borders of Egypt. Israel's Deputy Attorney General shared the shocking news while speaking at the International Court of Justice last week.
Nearly 700 tunnel shafts have been identified in Rafah, from which approximately 50 tunnels cross into Egypt. These tunnels are used by Hamas to supply itself with weapons and ammunition. It could potentially be used to smuggle out of Gaza hostages or Hamas senior operatives.
He then described Rafah as a focal point for ongoing terrorist activity and a stronghold for Hamas's operators. Israel claims to have already destroyed multiple terror tunnels and killed dozens of Hamas militants since launching their operations in Rafah earlier this month. Israel's defense minister says the military will expand operations in the city in order to keep the pressure on Hamas.
At the same time, Yemen's Houthi rebels claim to have destroyed another $32 million MQ-9 Reaper drone last week. The Iranian-backed militants say the drone was carrying out hostile actions over Yemen when they shot it down on Thursday. According to the statement, the drone was over a province held by allies of the nation's exiled government. The U.S. military has not confirmed the drone's loss. Meanwhile, the Houthis struck a Greek-owned oil tanker on Saturday and temporarily stranded it in the Red Sea, according to U.S. officials. There were no casualties, and the crew successfully made repairs without assistance.
And before we go to a break here, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are nearing the finish line on a rather historic security deal. In fact, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, he's been in Saudi Arabia this weekend negotiating that deal, which is now reportedly just days away. Saudi Arabian diplomats confirmed on Saturday that the draft agreement is nearly final. It reportedly includes an agreement on defense guarantees and civil nuclear cooperation, and also includes a pathway to normalize relationships between the Muslim country and Israel that is pending on the recognition of an official Palestinian state. Mind you, this comes at the same time when China is expanding its influence in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, for example, joined the BRICS economic bloc earlier this year, which was started in part by both Russia as well as China. All right, and we have plenty more news to get to up next, but first, let's go to a moment in history.
Welcome back to A Moment in History. I'm Seth Udinsky. In our journey through history, certain places in the world stick out as places of utmost importance in the story arc of humanity. Now, in the Holy Land, there's a place such as this that has seemed to play a vital role in multiple areas of human history, especially in regards to religion. It is to this day one of the most disputed historical landmarks in the world. Let's travel to the city of Jerusalem and discover the controversial history of the Temple Mount. The story of the Temple Mount begins in the 10th century BC. King David of Israel, under the blessing of God, had united the kingdom and made Jerusalem his capital city. His son Solomon then commissioned the construction of a lavish temple for the people of Israel to honor and worship God. For 400 years, this first temple stood as the crown jewel of the people of Israel. But as God had promised, disobedience would lead to destruction. Israel fell away from the commands of God, and God handed her over to her enemies. In 586 BC, the Babylonians sacked Jerusalem and destroyed the temple in one of the darkest events in ancient Israel. But several generations later, in the 5th century BC, the prophet Nehemiah returned to Jerusalem under the commissioning of King Artaxerxes of Persia. Under Nehemiah's lead, the temple was rebuilt, though not in the same splendor as the original. But like the first temple, the second would also fall to a pagan power. In AD 70, in line with a prophecy from Jesus himself, the Second Temple was destroyed by the Romans during the failed Jewish uprising to overthrow the Romans. Now, during the Roman domination of Jerusalem, the religious climate switched from paganism to Christianity under the Emperor Constantine. From the 300s to the 600s AD, the Temple Mount was held in Christian hands until the rise of the Muslim founder Muhammad. Muslim tradition holds that after Muhammad founded his new religion based on a vision he received, he traveled to Jerusalem and ascended into heaven from a rock at the Temple Mount. Islam grew at a rapid pace. The Muslims took over the city and the Temple Mount in the later 7th century. They built the Dome of the Rock in the 7th century over the place they claim their prophet ascended, which still stands today as one of the oldest Islamic shrines in the world. Well, since the Islamic takeover, the temple has remained largely in Muslim hands, with a few exceptions during the Crusades. Even after the return of the Israeli state in the 1940s, the iconic site in history remains one of the most disputed in the world as Jews and Muslims jockey for power and control. Though there are some who argue Islam has the rightful claim, common sense tells us that the Jewish people hold claim, since they had the original claim to the Temple Mount for over 1,000 years before Islam was even in existence. Thanks so much for joining me once again for a moment in history.
The miracle of carrying a child creates a unique bond between a mother and her unborn baby. She feels the baby's movements and responds to their needs even before birth. Help create that bond between an abortion-minded mother and her unborn child by giving the gift of life through Preborn. During the month of May, you can bless your mom for Mother's Day by giving to Preborn on your mother's behalf. For $28, you can sponsor an ultrasound scan that will enable an abortion-minded woman to hear the heartbeat of her baby. 90% of the time, that sound will change a woman's mind and cause her to keep their baby. Give the gift of life to the woman that gave you life by sponsoring an ultrasound. Go to preborn.com/FISM to give. That's preborn.com/FISM. You can help an abortion-minded mother receive discipleship, encouragement, and the strength needed to have her baby.
Did you know that you can always listen and watch Financial Issues online? Just go to financialissues.org/live or download the FISM TV app in the Google Play Store or the Apple App Store. We stream our show every weekday morning starting at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. If you're looking for a biblical take on investing and current events and how it relates to the money that God has given you, then you don't want to miss Financial Issues.
Hey there, and welcome back to FISM News. Once again, I'm Samuel Case. We begin this segment with an admission from the National Institute of Health. Frankly, years in the making. Last week, an NIH official told lawmakers for the first time that the U.S. had, in fact, been funding gain-of-function research in Wuhan, China, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Did NIH fund gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology through EcoHealth?
It depends on your definition of gain-of-function research. If you're speaking about the generic term, yes, we did, but this is research. The generic term is research that goes on in many, many labs around the country.
That was Principal Deputy Director Lawrence Tabak speaking to the House Coronavirus Subcommittee. His admission comes as for years now, health officials dodged claims of the U.S. funding controversial research aimed at making viruses more infectious. Dr. Anthony Fauci back in 2021 outright denied the claim during one of his many heated exchanges with Senator Rand Paul.
Dr. Fauci, do you still support funding of the NIH funding of the lab in Wuhan?
Senator Paul, with all due respect, you are entirely and completely incorrect that the NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute.
Republicans have often accused Fauci and others of playing semantic games with the definition. You might have heard Tabak do a little bit of that as well earlier in this story. According to the New York Post, the NIH back in 2021, in fact, scrubbed its longstanding definition of gain-of-function research completely from its website.
Meanwhile, Biden's former disinformation chief says she was told to be vague about her organization's role. The former head of the short-lived Disinformation Governance Board, Nina Jankowicz, admitted to Congress that the Department of Homeland Security intentionally glossed over transparency expectations. She said, quote, "The guidance from up above was that we were to be as vague as possible, which I found very frustrating." A couple months into her job, Jankowicz resigned from the board amid growing GOP criticism. The group soon dissolved after her departure. But Jankowicz had defended the board shortly after she left in 2022. She said that the board never had intentions of policing speech, but she changed her tune recently when she told Congress that the DHS threw her under the bus to avoid dealing with internal problems.
And speaking of speech, Kansas City Chiefs kicker Harrison Butker is seeing a boost in merch sales after sharing his traditional Catholic views in his recent graduate speech. That's despite pushback from the NFL. Women's jerseys surged in the best-selling ranking and were sold out as of Friday. That comes only one day after the NFL tried to distance itself from the kicker. Butker sparked a mix of outrage and also praise last week when he rejected abortion, criticized President Biden, and praised homemakers in remarks to Catholic graduates at Benedictine College. So far, over 200,000 people have since signed a petition demanding the Chiefs dismiss him, saying his comments reinforce harmful stereotypes in their opinion. Now, it's interesting because a lot of the criticism has come over his comments about women being homemakers and how a lot of women would be happier being homemakers. But what's so funny is that women are apparently liking that comment because they're the ones buying his jerseys now.
Right. I think this is a great example of the loud minority voicing their opinions on this issue versus the average American woman who obviously doesn't believe that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, and with that petition too, 200,000 people, that's a lot, but in the grand scheme of things, is it really that many people? Not really.
Yeah, it's just, they're ruffling some feathers, I'm sure. But.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. Well, lastly, a Christian alternative to the Boy Scouts is thriving and recently passed a new milestone. Trail Life USA, which stresses biblical faith and personal integrity, is now 60,000 members strong. Mark Hancock, an award-winning author and former household dad, began the scouting group back in 2013. He tells the Washington Examiner that its purpose is to provide positive male role models for young boys.
So in Trail Life USA, we think it's critical that we have good, godly men who are leading those boys because it gives them a sense of who it is that they are. You can't find them in sports, they can't find them in politics, they can't find them in front of them in the classroom, and a lot of them don't have them in their homes. So we surround them with these good and godly men to show them what it looks like to be a good man.
Trail Life troops are connected directly to churches. There are over 1,000 troops in the U.S. across dozens of denominations. And if you're interested, you can learn more at traillifeusa.com. That's traillifeusa.com.
Something that's desperately needed in the country right now, teaching young boys how to grow up and become good men.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just a great alternative to the Boy Scouts right now.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's our program for today. Thank you so much for joining us. And please visit FISMnews.tv for more content.
And as you know, you can follow us on social media or download the FISM app. We'll catch you tomorrow night with more news coverage. See you then.